Okay, the digital clock, I'm disappointed in myself. The digital clock says 5:01 now for some reason, but I think it's 5. So, welcome. For those of you whom I don't know, I'm Steve Ehrenberg. My team and I organize the public events here. Thanks for coming. It's a real pleasure to introduce Richard Martin. Richard is founder and president of Alcera Consulting. Prior to launching his consulting business, he attended Collège Militaire Royal de Saint-Jean as an officer cadet, and then served for 21 years as an infantry officer in the Canadian Army. His proudest moment in the military was successfully commanding a peacekeeping force in one of the worst flashpoints of Bosnia. His resolve and diplomatic skills in dealing with local authorities, citizens, and representatives of the international community were instrumental in securing the safe return of over 2,000 displaced persons during the 6-month period. At the time, historian David Bergeson wrote in the National Post that Richard Martin and his company can do no wrong. Richard has led teams and worked in multicultural and multinational projects and environments on a number of continents. He's based in Montreal and works both nationally and internationally. He speaks, teaches, and writes on a variety of topics. He teaches strategic management and project management at Université de Quebec on, how do you pronounce it?
Outaouais.
Outaouais, in the Outaouais.
St. Hall.
And his first commercially published book, Brilliant Manoeuvres, How to Use Military Wisdom to Win Business Battles, was published last month by Global Professional Publishing. Many of you have your copy. So Richard, welcome to Rotman. The room is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Steve, to speak at the school. I'm really enthusiastic about being able to speak here today for 2 main reasons, actually for 3, which I just added. But the first main reason is because I'm getting to speak at the Rotman School. So because of your reputation and the reputation of the school, both nationally and internationally, it's probably the premier business school in Canada. So it's a great privilege for me, and I feel honored to be able to do that. The second reason is it's my first speech really to talk about a topic related to the book. And the title of my topic today is How to Use Military Wisdom to Win Business Battles. And I'm going to focus in on the more human side of that. I don't want to get into too much nuts and bolts and technicalities. A lot of those are covered in the book. But I want to focus more on leadership aspects, motivational and organizational dynamics aspects. And the third reason is I get to meet with my old buddy, Tim Patrickin. We went to Collège Militaire Royal, CMR, together, and we haven't seen each other since 1982. And he came out to this event when he found out about it. And that just shows the power of the military. Once you form bonds with people, I know you've been in the military, but once you form a bond with somebody, you really are brothers for life. So thanks for coming out, Tim. I'm honored to see you there. So when we hear the words military wisdom, what are some of the thoughts that come to mind? Maybe some of the students can weigh in. What are some of what's that?
Oxymoron.
Oxymoron. Okay, that like military intelligence? Okay. Apart from the oxymoron, what are some of the thoughts that spring to mind when you hear that? Discipline. Okay. Anything else? Yes? Command structure. So very disciplined, very strict command structure. Anything else? Strategy.
Chaotic environments.
Chaotic environments. Yeah, we're all familiar with that, certainly in business these days. Anything else? And okay, you were going to say adapt and overcome. Okay, so and all these are all good things, and they're all real. They're all true. But what I'd like to do today is focus in on one particular aspect, and what I think a principle, really a fundamental or essential principle that underlies a lot of the principles of military wisdom. And I go into some detail on this in the book, but I'd just like to take a different spin on that today. And if you read the book, and hopefully you will, you'll see it mentioned. But I'd just like to emphasize it in a different way. And to see if you can see where I'm going with this, I'd like to give 3 typical situations we see in companies or any kind of organization. So the first one is a company decides to introduce a new product or service after some of their clients, through their sales force, tell them they would like the company to create this new product or service and sell it to them. So that's the first example. The second situation is a team leader or a manager goes to her supervisor and says, with my team, we've developed a new approach for whatever it is, could be operational, could be logistical, that will save money and time, but I need a certain investment and I need your support. And that supervisor gives the support and the investment, the additional resources to that person. And the final situation is it could be any kind of organization, but there's a manager within that organization or a team leader who has to go away on medical leave for a number of months. And that manager's supervisor, that manager's boss, has to decide, should I take the person who has the most seniority and put that person in charge temporarily as an interim manager or team leader, or should I go with a younger person who has maybe less experience but has a lot of potential to lead and has expressed the willingness to lead and take on more responsibilities? So that manager decides to go with the person who she estimates has more leadership potential and is willing to take on more responsibilities. So I'm wondering if you can see where I'm going with this. What is the underlying principle that's acting out here, or that's at play?
Teamwork and buy-in.
Teamwork and buy-in, okay. Anything else? What do they have in common, these three situations? Some kind of transformation, but it's even simpler than that. Yes? Risk. The basic element that's at play here, what these three managers or organizations are doing is they're following the path of least resistance. They are going with the flow, if you want to call it that. So in the first case, they've got customers telling them, we want you to do this and sell it to us. So they're not fighting the problem. They're saying, okay, we'll do that. Obviously, they do their business case and determine that it's worthwhile. In the second case, a manager or a team leader comes up with an idea and says, I got an idea to be innovative. Can you support me? So once again, you're reinforcing success. You're following the path of least resistance. And it's the same thing in the last case. Appointing the experienced or the person with a lot of seniority that doesn't necessarily have high leadership potential to be an interim manager or leader is not necessarily the best approach. It's better to go with somebody who's expressed the willingness to take on more responsibilities and is motivated to do that and has the potential. So what I'd like to do today is focus in on this principle, the path of least resistance. It underlies a lot of military strategy and it underlies a lot of military wisdom, where you try to avoid battles that you can't win. You try to avoid, if at all possible, going against taking your strengths and pitting them against the enemy's strengths or the competition's, or going against basic human nature, whether that's in the people you lead or in the people you're trying to overcome and impose your will on. I'm going to do this at the strategic level, and that'll introduce the concept, and we'll explore it a bit more. So talking about how this can affect strategy in a company. The second point I'd like to look at is how this can play out and how this can be applied in organizational dynamics, how you can organize and plan your work around this concept of following the path of least resistance. And we'll do that by talking about a concept that the military uses, specifically the Army, which is called mission command, which I'll describe in more detail later. And then finally, we'll explore how this can apply in the field of leadership. How can we lead organizations better? How can we lead people better at the individual level by working with their intrinsic motivation and with human nature rather than trying to continually go against it? And the way we'll look at that is through the concept of transformational leadership, which has been officially recognized as the military leadership approach, at least in the Canadian military. And when they announced that this was our approach to leadership, we all went, Oh, we've been doing that since forever. So that's what I want to talk about today. So let's start with the first part, looking at it strategically, and just use that as a way to introduce the concept and talk about it in a bit more depth, the path of least resistance. What is the path of least resistance? I was having breakfast this morning with another old military buddy, a guy called Cliff Trollope, and we were talking about how military wisdom can apply to business and leadership and management in general. And spontaneously, he said, don't fight battles. Don't pick fights you can't win. It's another way of saying follow the path of least resistance. And it brought back to mind an experience I had when I was in Bosnia in 1999-2000, as it was mentioned in the introduction. One of the things that happened when I got there in 1999 with my company group, so I had a group of about 150 men and a camp in a place called Drvar. There was a Croat militia unit, a Croat HVO, that means the Croat militia, that had fought in Bosnia against Serbs and Bosniaks, Muslims. And it was a small unit, about 400 or 500 men. But as soon as we got there, they wanted to do, even though the fighting was over, there was a lot of maneuvering like this to impose their will and to oppose the Dayton Peace Accords, the peace that we were there to impose in NATO, in our peacekeeping mission. And one of the things they wanted to do was to organize a sports day between their unit and my unit. I said, fine, we'll do that. After a while, I started getting a bit antsy because I noticed that they were inviting Croatian generals, not from Bosnia, but from Croatia. They had athletes from across the Croatian army in Croatia, not in the Croat part of Bosnia. Some of these were professional athletes, professional soccer players in the Croatian league. And they were also inviting the national Croatian news. So at one point, we just thought this was a friendly activity. We'll get together, have a barbecue, and they'll get to learn from us, and et cetera. What I realized at one point was they viewed this as a continuation of war by other means. They wanted to use this to humiliate us in front of the Croat population. So at one point, I said to my sergeant major, I really don't feel good about this. We have everything to lose and nothing to gain. They have everything to gain and nothing to lose. So this is a battle I can't win. It's just a stupid sports day, but we're going to be humiliated if we try and compete against them, and they're taking this very seriously. So I canceled the sports day, and they were very pissed off, but that's another issue. Subsequently, one of the people in the international community, Jose Uceda, who is the local representative of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, he came up to me and he told me, he said, I'm so glad you canceled that because the previous tour, the previous group had been humiliated. And the Croats were laughing at the Canadian soldiers in the streets afterwards. They were saying, aha, we beat you. And in that kind of a mission, that kind of a role, prestige is everything. So even though you're not fighting with bullets, you have to be able to impress the local population with your military prowess and with your skills. And the previous unit before us had lost a lot of, as we'd say in French, they lost a lot of prestige with the locals. Not just the Croats, but also the Serbs. So that's an example of following the principle of least resistance, or following the path of least resistance, because trying to continue with this sports day would have been like going against like a frontal attack on their fortress. There was no point in doing this. We couldn't win, so we pulled back and we withdrew from that. It was something we couldn't win. There's to illustrate a bit better the principle in its purest form. Some of you may have read Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Some of you, like me, the first time I read it, didn't understand it. And even now, there are some parts I don't understand. But one of the things that Sun Tzu said, and it really illustrates this principle, I got a quote in the book here, military tactics are like unto water, for water in its natural course runs away from high places and hastens downwards. So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe he is facing. Therefore, just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare there are no constant conditions. So what he means by this is water, of course, follows gravity. It avoids obstacles. It infiltrates. It seeps in. It avoids the strengths. It avoids high points and exploits weakness and low points. So that's really the way you have to be in your strategy, in your interactions, and in your leadership. It doesn't mean you try to hoodwink people if you're leading them, but rather than trying to go against the grain, go against people's wishes all the time, go against human nature, try as much as possible to work with human nature and to work with people's intrinsic motivation and their wishes, what they want to do. So if you're aligned that way, you can get a lot more accomplished. It's more efficient and it's more effective. He also said that an army should be just like water and adopt formlessness, be formless. So what does this mean? Once again, water adapts to any shape of the container, whether the container is square, triangular, round, long, short, high, low. Water will adapt to that form. We just saw it yesterday with these storm surges along the east coast of the United States. Water will get in anywhere. So this is the principle we want to apply when we're looking strategically at how we can grow our businesses, how we can manage our teams, how we can organize and plan our work, and how we can lead our people. By going with the flow, by being formless and being like water and seeping around obstacles and shaping ourselves according to the lay of the land and according to the situation. So this can be applied in two areas. The first is competitive. Conflict and competition. So obviously when we're talking about business, we're talking about a competitive situation, and that can be compared to war and conflict, where you've got two forces going against each other, or more forces. The other situation is in a situation of cooperation. So I'll talk about the conflict and competitive situations first, and then the rest of the presentation will look at the cooperative situations, internal to the organization and the company. So in a conflict situation, what you're trying to do is avoid your enemy or your competitor's strengths. You're trying to go around that. If you go head-to-head against your competitors, that's like a frontal attack. It's like attacking a fort head-on. And that's where the enemy has all its firepower, because he expects you to come that way. So it's the worst way to go. It takes a lot of resources, and you're probably not going to win. It's much better to go around the obstacles and around the existing competitors, around the existing positions. So the best example I can give of that, I've got two examples. One is very well known. It's back in 2007 when Apple was about to introduce the iPhone. So Jobs and Apple wanted to be present with a smartphone in the mobile computing and communications market. At that time, I know it's hard to remember, it's hard to believe it, but research in motion really had the most lucrative part of the market sewn up with the BlackBerry, the institutional and corporate markets, even government. And their key selling point was reliability and security. So that's where the money was, and that's where the big clienteles were. Instead of going up against that, what did Apple do? Apple went around that position, went around the BlackBerry and research in motion, and created the iPhone. And created the iPhone for the individual consumer, the individual user. And that allowed them to bypass research in motion. And once they had established themselves in that market, what started to happen? Users started to say, we want to be able to use the iPhone and then the iPad in our company, in our organization, in our institution. So without really trying to market actively to the corporate or the organizational market, Apple has started making inroads in that market. So it's just like water seeping in under your foundation. Once they had established themselves beyond research in motion, the water started coming back and seeping under the research in motion's foundations, and we see what the effect is today. Another example, I have a client It's a small company, but and they're in the event management field. And one of their salespeople went to a trade convention and met with somebody who developed software applications for events. So they decided to implement this, create a joint venture, and to implement this with this joint venture partner. And they're having a lot of success with it. The advantage of this and why this shows following the path of least resistance is because it came from somebody fairly low down in the company, seeing an opportunity, and then the company's management said, let's reinforce this. Let's reinforce this suggestion, this innovative idea, and put resources behind it. And now it's starting to have a major impact on their business. So, and it's bringing them into a whole new space that they did not occupy even a year ago. Had they not done that, they would have been in a much more precarious position right now. And that's where a lot of their growth is coming from. And it's having a knock-on effect on other aspects of their business. So they can, who knows, maybe they'll be introducing other products. So this is the kind of thing, it doesn't have to be something massive like Apple introducing the iPhone. It can be small things like this. But when you've got people out there, if they know where you're going with the company and they know what the intent is, they can come back with these ideas and you can reinforce them and give them resources so that you're building on this success and introducing new product lines, new categories of products, new processes to continue growing. Okay, that's me. Apparently I can't breathe, but I can speak. Okay. So that's the competitive and conflict sphere. What about in the sphere of cooperation inside the company? Like I said a while ago, you don't want to be in a win-lose situation. In competition and conflict, it's win-lose. But when you're leading a team, when you're leading a company, when you're managing people, or when you're working with suppliers or distributors or joint venture partners or strategic alliance partners, you want to create a win-win situation. And if you're talking also about your customers, you want it to be win-win-win. Now, I know it sounds tacky and campy, but it's true. You want everybody to get something out of the relationship. So in the military, the approach that builds on this and that aligns with natural proclivities and people's natural way of wanting to work and wanting to be as efficient as possible is called mission command. And this also follows the path of least resistance because of a couple of reasons. First of all, it exploits the already existing hierarchy. As you know, military units are very hierarchical. They're like pyramids. And there's a reason for that because you have to break down responsibilities because there's something called the span of control. There's only so many people that any individual commander can control. And it starts at the ground level with individual detachments and crews and sections, and then they're grouped together into platoons and companies and battalions and brigades and divisions, etc. So at each level, you've got commanders, you've got leaders, and they've got second in command, and in some case, staff officers. So it leverages the already existing chain of command, this pyramid that already exists. And most companies and organizations have these kinds of pyramidal organizations. Even the flattest ones, there's some kind of pyramid, some kind of hierarchy in place. What's that, sorry?
I was going to say somebody is at the top.
Yeah, and there's somebody at the top. The buck stops somewhere. But the other reason Mission Command works very well is because it exploits people's will or people's motivation to be autonomous, to be creative, and to show their initiative and use their own intelligence to solve problems and to achieve objectives. So in Mission Command, the basic philosophy of Mission Command is tell people what they need to achieve and why they need to achieve it, and then let them figure out the best way to achieve it. Now, it's not a free-for-all. You can't just do whatever you want. There are processes and procedures in place. There are, as we'd say in the military, left and right of arc. You know, you have constraints and restraints. You're told certain things you can't do or that you must do. But within that framework, you're free to innovate. You're free to use your initiative and to work with your team to develop novel approaches to solving problems. And that has a couple of advantages. In the first instance, when you come up against problems, which are inevitable in military operations, you come up against an enemy position that you did not expect was going to be there, so it screws up your plan. Well, if people know what the ultimate objective is and what the ultimate scheme of maneuver is, they can work around that and create a new plan on the fly. They can improvise and still attain the aim by going around that position or slightly modifying the mission or working with their peers in other organizations at the same level and coming up with an alternate plan so that they're achieving the aim. So the same principle can be applied in business. But for that, people need to know what the overall objective is. I'll get to that in a second. The other advantage and why it follows, so we can see it follows the path of least resistance there, but the other reason it follows the path of least resistance is that, as I said, people work better when they have control over how they do things. It's even better if they can contribute to the definition of objectives and define their mission and their vision. But if there are limitations on that and they have freedom of action to exercise their initiative and their imagination and creativity to come up with solutions and to control how they work, that has a major impact on individual motivation and morale and cohesiveness within an organization. So on two levels, it has an external benefit in that the organization is more adaptable. Somebody a while ago talked about flexibility and adaptability under chaos. If you truly exercise mission command, the organization is very flexible. So even though you got a very rigid structure and a very rigid hierarchy, people know what the overarching objective is, and they can work around problems to achieve the aim despite these obstacles that come up. So, I need to check my notes here. So this is really how, specifically in the Army, especially in the Army, you get coordination of tens, hundreds, thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands and millions of people on a battlefield. And it's not a perfect system, but it's the best system given the situation, the chaotic environment that you're operating in. So on the military side, what does a commander do? A commander defines his end state, his or her end state. Says, at the end of this operation or of this mission, I want to be in such and such a situation. I want us to be up to this river and having captured and secured this objective. So that describes the end state. Everybody understands what the end state looks like. That corresponds on the business side to a vision. What is the organizational vision? What does the company want to be? Where does it want to be in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? Then on the military side, the commander gives his intent. That is, he says, here's how I intend to operate. Here's my scheme of maneuver. So he gives the very general plan, the overarching plan and scheme of maneuver. On the business side, that's the strategy, really. Here's how we're going to position ourselves. Here's how we're going to demarcate ourselves. Here's how we're going to differentiate ourselves. And then on the military side, you have the mission and the plan. Same thing on the business side, the mission and the plan. Although they mean slightly different things, for our purposes today, we can say they're roughly equivalent. The beauty of this approach is, in military terms, when something happens that you have to deviate from the plan, you've got a common position to deviate from, and because people know where they're going, they can then readjust on the fly. Now, I had another client where we went through this process of creating a strategy, except my client, who owned the company, didn't take the time to communicate the new vision and intent and mission to all of his managers. So they lost a lot of time and effort because when it came time to work with one of the other teams, one of the sales teams, these people did not know what the new mission was. Had they known 6 months before, they could have started creating new processes and new innovative solutions to be able to keep growing. And I remember one particular meeting we had where I said, well, you could do such and such. And the director of sales said to the owner of the company, well, we can't do that. That's not what our mission is. That's not what this company is about. And I said, actually, that goes exactly with the new mission statement. So, and she said, well, I didn't know that. So obviously I can't say names because it's a client, it's confidential, but we can see the effect of not doing that. So you see a company pays a lot of good money to get a strategy, to develop a new strategy, a mission, a vision statement, needs to communicate this to people. The way the military does this is it allows every level to break it out hierarchically. So you take your overarching mission and your vision at the highest level, and then, say, at the brigade level, then the brigade commander tells each of the battalions and regiments what they need to be able to do, what their tasks are. And then those battalion commanders do what's called a mission analysis and determine what it is that they're supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to be achieving as an outcome. And then they do that with their company commanders or squadron commanders, who do that with their platoon or troop commanders, who do that with their section commanders. And the section commanders do it with their soldiers. It goes up and down the line like that. So at every level, you've got a vision or statement of intent or a statement of end state. You've got a mission statement. You've got a plan, and it's built around a strategy or a scheme of maneuver or a concept of operations, whatever you want to call it. People get tasks. They're told what they're supposed to be achieving, and then they're told, you have such and such an amount of time to come up with a plan to do it yourself. And then they fit within that scheme. So everybody knows where they fit in. So it's like the example I gave a while ago of that salesperson went off to a trade convention, met with a company. Because that salesperson, she knew that this was a direction that the president was looking at and was possibly wanting to take, and it said, come up with some good ideas. Because she knew it was within that overarching vision, she was able to start making contact with this company, the potential joint venture partner, and come back with this information to the company. So you've got field service reps, you've got salespeople, you've got customer service reps. They're out there rubbing shoulders with customers. They're rubbing shoulders with competitors. They're going to trade conventions. They're hearing things. They're seeing things. What information can they bring back? This is the best way to organize work, because by breaking it down into manageable pieces, it follows the path of least resistance. You don't just have a strategy up here and then everybody's trying to do tactically something to fit in. You create structures, you create visions and mission statements at each level so that people know how they fit into the bigger picture. And in the military, generally, what it is you look at the intent 2 levels higher, and the intent and concept of operations 1 level higher. So when things inevitably go wrong, and as we used to say in the military, no plan survives contact with the enemy, because the enemy gets to do things too, right? So it's just like your competitors. They get to react to what you do, and then you have to react to what they do. So if everybody is pulling in the same direction, this creates unity of effort, unity of purpose, cohesiveness, increases morale, and then you get better results. Just before I go to I'll give an example, once again, one of my clients, how we did this, but this to me is the biggest challenge in business. Whenever I talk to prospects or clients, they always say, I get this plan, I got this vision, I know what I want, but how do I communicate it? How do I get everybody working in the same direction? It's the big challenge. And sometimes jokingly I say, everybody's got a brilliant strategy. Implementation, execution, not so good. That's where the real challenge is. And that's where this concept of mission command comes into play. And it works because it follows the path of least resistance. It allows you to get around obstacles externally in your strategy, in your execution, and it also leverages the natural proclivities of people, what they want to do. So the example is one of my clients. They had, through acquisitions, they had acquired a number. It's a mid-sized software consulting firm. So they implement software solutions. And it was a bunch of vertical silos. So they had 7 or 8 different practices, as they call them. So CRM and business intelligence and ERP and these kinds of things. And through a process of accretion, they had grown by acquisition. There was some organic growth, but it was mostly by acquisition. So as these owners of these companies that were being acquired, they were made senior vice presidents and put in charge of a couple of these silos. So they had 7 or 8 different silos, 3 groups. So they had 2 or 3 of these silos each. And each of these silos did their own business development, their own marketing, sales, their contracting. They did their implementation and delivery, after-sales support, and they did their own upselling within that, and customer relationship and repeat business. The problem was they realized they were leaving a tremendous amount of money on the table because they could be cross-selling, quite apart from other elements such as even beyond cross-selling. They realized that some customers over here could be customers for this group. So there's a tremendous opportunity there for them. So we did a strategy retreat, and we determined what the overall vision and mission was. But then when we got to the level below that, we had to identify what should be the groupings. And we created 3 functional groupings rather than these 7 individual silos or practice groupings. And so there's a sales and marketing organization, there's a operational delivery organization, and an operational support organization. And the CEO said, okay, to each of the senior vice presidents, you do that, you do that, and you do that. And then we did a mission analysis, a military-style mission analysis. By the time we'd gone through each one, at the end of it, I said, what is your mission? What's your objective for this organization? And they said it like that. So they knew how they fit into the big picture, how they fit into this puzzle that is this company. Not everybody has the same role. The operational support guy's role isn't to be selling, but he has to be supporting those who are selling. And the operational delivery people are the ones that are delivering on what the salespeople are selling. So it doesn't make much of a difference at the operating level, but at the senior level, it changes the whole picture of how they conceive their business. And this, hopefully, will allow them to do more of this cross-selling. And then they can turn around and apply the same principles to their teams, to their subordinate elements, the same kind of mission command concept. So that's the vision. And finally, we get to the individual level. And really the question is, would you rather be told what to do in detail and how to do it? Or would you rather your boss tell you or even contribute to the development of your objectives, personal and operational, what you're supposed to be delivering, and then left to figure out with your team, to work with your team, to create the best solution possible? I think we'd all prefer the second one. Certainly I do. And this principle, which is really the basis of transformational leadership. You've probably heard the term. It's a bit fashionable these days. And like I said a while ago, when they introduced it into the Canadian forces, we all sort of went, well, we knew that. That's how we do it. Now we know it's got a name. And what transformational leadership does is, once again, it goes with the flow. It follows the path of least resistance. So there's the concept, really, we owe it. There was a guy back in the 70s who wrote a book, James McGregor Burns, I think his name was, and he saw transactional and transformational leadership, but in the context of politics and politicians. In the early 80s, there was a psychological researcher, a psychologist, Bernard Bass, who took on this concept, and he wrote a book that came out, I think, in 1985 called Leadership and Performance Beyond Expectations. For his initial research, he went to the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force and military elements and said, who are your best leaders? And then he studied the best leaders and came up with the common factors in their leadership. And what he found was that even though military leaders have at their disposal all kinds of tools to coerce people, ironically, they prefer not to, at least not in Western countries or in Anglo-Saxon countries. So the irony is that you've got all this, you've got a big stick, but you prefer not to use it. And why not? Because you know it's not as effective as influencing and motivating people intrinsically. So what Bass discovered was that there are really four critical elements to transformational leadership. So there's idealized influence. And that really what it boils down to is providing a vision, a compelling vision of where you can be and what people as a team can be and what individuals can do as individuals to stretch them. So it's leading by example. And then there's inspirational motivation. So really providing the example and taking people to the next level by showing how you can do that and working with them. So those two combined, he said, that's basically charisma. And then the other two elements are intellectual stimulation and then individualized consideration. So when you look at it, when you're saying you're in charge of such and such a unit, and here's what I want you to achieve and why I want you to achieve it, fill your boots. That's very intellectually stimulating. And it also shows a lot of individualized consideration, especially if you say, I'm giving you this task because it's hard, because I want to stretch you, get you out of your comfort zone. So it's sort of like the example I gave at the beginning with the manager that had, or the young person that had a lot of potential and wanted to grow and wanted to get more responsibilities. So given the opportunity, the manager was able to provide that solution, or provide that opportunity, sorry. So all those things together, really what they do is they work to leverage and exploit individuals' intrinsic motivation. And all the research shows, and certainly my personal experience, and I'm sure it's the same with most of you, that it's much better if you're intrinsically motivated to do something. If the motivation comes from inside you, it's more efficient and it's more effective over the long term. Now, this can be contrasted with transactional leadership, which basically boils down to this: if you do this, I will give you this reward, or I will, if you don't do it, I will punish you. Or if you do it, I will punish you. That, in appearance, we tend to default to that. Like some of you may have kids. That's what we tend to default to with kids until we smarten up and realize it doesn't work. So, like an example I discovered with one of my teenage daughters, there's no point in confronting her at the dinner table. I wait until I got her in the car and I'm bringing her somewhere, see one of her friends or something, and then say, you know, that thing you said at the table wasn't very nice. Well, there's nobody else around, so she doesn't need to save face, right? So I can get through. So that's a way to break down the resistance. So this is a way to go with the flow, to go with the path of least resistance, because people who are intrinsically motivated want to get things done and want to achieve things. So I'll just leave you with a couple of examples of that kind of leadership and working with the intrinsic motivation of people. Once again, I go back to my Bosnian experience. What I did was I had 3 platoon commanders, so I gave them, I didn't just say, you know, you're going to rotate through these tasks. I gave them specific tasks. So to one of them I said, you're going to occupy a platoon house down in another town called Bosgrahovo. And it was sufficiently far that he would be autonomous. So he would operate in basically the same way I would operate with the rest of the company in Drvar, but he would do it as in a miniature form down in this town. So he had all the freedom of maneuver and action to work down there with his platoon and his team. Another one of my platoon commanders, I put him in charge of liaison and inspections of the Croat brigade. This is the unit I was telling you at the beginning. So we had to do regular inspections. And there was all kinds of specialized knowledge. So by putting him in charge of that, even though he had other responsibilities, that was his personal responsibility. He was my HVO liaison officer. So he could get good at it, and it also motivated him because he was specialized. And then the other platoon commander, I said, you're going to be in charge of psychological operations. And as part of that, there was the S4 radio show. We had this radio show on the local civilian radio station once a week. And it was really propaganda with a lot of heavy rock music between it. But anyway, and what did he do? He went through the company and he found there's always these guys that have the gift of the gab, and they're sort of like amateur DJs. So they did the DJ thing. So we were able to use people's native abilities and their talents and their interests and to leverage this in order to achieve a military mission. So that's just one example of how using these skill sets that these individuals had and what interested them, and by giving them a specialized task and telling them this is a very important mission, it's a very important role, and they knew how they fit into the big picture. It was very motivating. So it was very transformational, as someone pointed out at the beginning. So that's really the path of least resistance in leadership. Rewards and punishments, they work to a certain extent. We know that rewards work to a certain extent in very routine tasks. But now we're all in environments, we're all facing situations that are constantly changing, very dynamic environment, very competitive, very chaotic. There's a lot of uncertainty and risk and threats coming out of nowhere. We can even say now that many of the threats for a lot of companies aren't even other companies. If you're trying to build a pipeline now, you have to take into consideration environmental groups, governmental organizations and agencies. There could be foreign governments that might, or foreign countries that might have an interest in how it plays out in your country. And that's what we're seeing, for instance, with the pipeline out west. I forget the name of it, the Keystone XL pipeline. Last year, there's a company called Stratfor. They do strategic forecasting. George Friedman. So he has a lot of government and other clients that presumably pay a lot of money to get his strategic advice pertaining to political risk mainly and political evaluations. And I guess there's some group that doesn't like this company for whatever reason. They completely shut down their computer operations. They penetrated all their computer networks, stole all the credit card numbers, stole the client lists, and shut down operations of Stratfor for several weeks last December. And it must have cost several millions of dollars for Stratfor to get things back in order. So that's not even a commercial competitor. So in this kind of a situation, it's very dynamic, and you need creativity, you need initiative, you need novel solutions. So just giving people bonuses and various kinds of material rewards like that or incentives is not sufficient. People have to feel part of the solution. They have to feel part of the organization, know where it's going, so that they can use their initiative to work around obstacles and to point out potential problems. That's where transformational leadership comes into play, and it reinforces mission command, and it gives you much more flexibility to follow the path of least resistance. And it's also following the path of least resistance with your people. So that's the end of the formal part of my presentation. I open the floor for questions now. I think it's about 10:02. A couple of minutes for questions and answers. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Giving people the what, sorry? Okay. Right.
Using your analogy of the water, if the water is heading towards a cliff, you're going to lose your water if it goes over the cliff.
Okay.
So it's always important, I think, my experience, to have some kind of boundaries for that give certain amount of freedom, but you also have to establish boundaries which they can operate. So, again, in your analogy, you could use
Well, yeah. So basically, your comment or your question is, how do you keep people within boundaries like that? You can't just give people complete free rein. Yes, I think that's evident, and I did say that you have to have certain boundaries. It's a framework, it's a concept for thinking of how you plan work, how you apportion work, and how you motivate people. That's more what it's about. But obviously, if somebody comes back and says you don't want them doing all like a bunch of lemmings going over the cliff there every 4 years, you want somebody to come back and say there's a cliff over there. But that's part of it too, because if they come back and say there's a cliff over there, you shouldn't say, well, keep going. Good point. Yes?
Have you come across any instances where the military way to do things that was totally wrong, or big disasters blow up?
Yeah, when you can't use guns in business.
Right.
Seriously, I haven't given a lot of consideration to it. There are situations, and I'll give you some clear examples. For instance, in the military, like I said, if somebody doesn't follow orders, you can send them to jail. I mean, there's a whole military discipline system to deal with that. If somebody says, I don't want to go and attack the enemy, you can say, well, you will go, and if you don't, I'm going to arrest you. So that doesn't apply. There is a limit, and at some point, I would say that the comparison does break down. But that could be for any domain. What I'm trying to do here is introduce useful concepts that I think are useful, and that certainly when former military people, when we're working out, in business environment, in the civilian environment, we're saying, geez, there's so much stuff we can use. How can we transfer some of this knowledge and information to people in companies and other kinds of organizations? So, yeah, there are limits, but I think I prefer to look at what's applicable because there's so much that is, and I think there's so much that business people can learn from that approach and can profit from that approach. Answer your question? Moderately?
Yeah.
Anything else? Yes.
I was thinking of the example that you gave, and it almost sounds like you were set up because, another example, because you said when you talked to someone else, they told
The sports days you were talking, the sports games?
When you took the job, someone should have told you, don't even go near this. But along those lines, how do you apply these concepts in an organization if you're part of a structure that doesn't share the same views? So you have a little, you set this up within your own group, but you may be part of a hierarchy that says there's no way we want someone operating in this fashion.
That's why it's good. You're right. There's a limit to how much you can do if you're at the mid-level of an organization and the company says, no, we don't want customer service reps making any decisions. And there are companies that are famous for this. I think it was Ritz-Carlton, that anybody in the company could make a $2,500 commitment to a client. It starts at the top. You can do, there's a limit to what you can do as a mid-level or a low-level or even a high-level manager if nobody around you wants to do the same thing. But within that limit, you can give as much freedom of maneuver and use mission command and certainly transformational leadership as much as possible. For instance, there's nothing stopping you from developing your people, from talking to your people. If you look in Chapter 10, I've got there's 10 principles. I didn't invent them. They're military leadership, basic military leadership principles. And when you look at them, you say, well, that's so self-evident. But the reason they're so self-evident is because we often forget them. I like to say, I know so much about the leadership principles because I've broken every single one of them. Sometimes intentionally, but mostly unintentionally. But lead by example, pretty basic. You don't need other people cooperating with you for you as a leader to lead by example. You don't need others to be ethical yourself. Pursue professional competence. Talk to your people. Give them an overview of the situation. These are all basic leadership principles that are transformational. And you don't need the permission of other people, whether it's peers, subordinates, or superiors, to do that. So you're right, there are limits, but there's a lot you can do yourself. Does that answer your question? You had a question?
Yeah, we hear a lot about creativity.
Yes.
More so now than ever.
Phil, or you can comment on your thoughts about mission command or hierarchical structures. I find it might stifle this creativity that we're all searching after in the business world. And too much bureaucracy, say red tape and such.
So the question is, I'm not sure what your question is.
I was asking if there's too much hierarchy, introduces too much bureaucracy, stifles any form of creativity within the organization.
Okay. When I talk about hierarchy in the military, I mean it's like a pyramid organization. And it is very hierarchical. But there's a surprising amount of discussion that goes on. So what I find is a lot of people, for whatever reason, managers, executives, are afraid of losing control. So they're afraid of saying, if I let my people, I say, here's what I'm trying to do, figure out how to do it, come up with ideas, and we'll see what works. I will encourage you and reinforce successful ideas. That means you have to be willing to let them fail too. So there's a certain risk in that. Some people just can't give up control. And some companies are so tightly run and so tightly wound that it becomes very difficult to give people that freedom. It's a balancing act. You try and achieve as much as possible as that within the constraints that you're facing with budgets or whatever. But I like to think that the real problem is not enough creativity. You're better to encourage creativity and then stop it than to say, oh, we're afraid that it might get out of control. Does that answer your question? Any other questions?
Well, perfect timing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's fantastic.
Thank you.